A quiet lunch interrupted. Derek Saunders stepped into the grand entrance of Maison Blanche, an upscale French restaurant known for its opulent chandeliers and polished marble floors. He was out of his element, evident in his simple attire. An old but clean military jacket, faded jeans, and well-worn boots. Derek didn't usually frequent such lavish places. Still, his best friend, James, had insisted. "You need a break, man. Just one nice meal where you don't have to think about anything else," James had said, shoving the reservation card into Derek's hand. The maitre d' gave him a once-over as he walked in, his neutral expression failing to hide the flicker of surprise at Derek's attire. But Derek didn't care. He'd faced worse judgments in his life. He was led to a small corner table, tucked away from the restaurant's more glamorous clientele, and he was fine with that. Peace and quiet were all he wanted. As he sat down, Derek took a deep breath. For once, he wasn't thinking about his time in the military or the ghosts that haunted him. He wasn't dwelling on the friends he had lost or the sacrifices he had made. Today, he just wanted to eat a good meal and enjoy a moment of normalcy. Across the room, Julian Beck, a man in his late 40s with perfectly coiffed hair and a tailored navy suit, held court at a large table. His booming laughter echoed across the dining room, competing with the soft piano music in the background. Julian oozed wealth, with his gleaming Rolex and the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around him. Derek noticed him briefly, but quickly looked away. He wasn't here to judge anyone or to be noticed. He took a sip of water, scanning the menu with mild apprehension. Every dish sounded foreign, expensive, and a little intimidating. As Derek waited for his meal, Julian's voice grew louder. His table erupted into laughter at a joke Derek hadn't heard, but their collective amusement grated on his nerves. He tried to focus on the comforting hum of the restaurant's ambience, but it was impossible to ignore the self-satisfied tone of Julian's voice. Julian's gaze eventually landed on Derek. At first, it was a casual glance, but then his eyes lingered. The corner of Julian's mouth twitched, and Derek could feel the judgment radiating from across the room. He kept his head down, pretending not to notice, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The waiter arrived with Derek's order, a modest steak and a side of roasted vegetables. Derek nodded his thanks, eager to enjoy his meal in peace, but peace wasn't on the menu today. Well, Julian's voice rang out, louder than necessary. "It seems they'll let just about anyone dine here these days." Derek froze, his fork hovering midair. He wasn't entirely sure Julian was talking to him until the man added, "That jacket, army surplus, right? Must have been tough saving up for a meal like this." The words hit Derek like a slap. He'd endured plenty of subtle and overt comments about his background before, but there was something particularly galling about this man's sneering tone. He looked up, locking eyes with Julian for the first time. The man's smirk deepened, and his friends chuckled awkwardly, clearly unsure whether to laugh or to cringe. Derek clenched his jaw and lowered his gaze back to his plate. He wasn't here to cause a scene. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Derek, always hold your head high, but don't let your temper do the talking." Julian wasn't done. "I mean, it's great, really, seeing people like you trying new things. Fancy restaurants, and all that. A step up from mess hall food, huh?" The laughter at Julian's table was louder this time, more pointed. Derek's chest tightened. The restaurant seemed to grow quieter as more diners tuned in, sensing the tension. Derek took a slow, deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of the table to steady himself. He thought about all the times he'd ignored people like Julian. Arrogant, entitled individuals who believed their wealth or status gave them the right to belittle others. Usually, he could brush it off. But today, something was different. Julian's comment wasn't just an insult. It was a jab at everything Derek had endured and everything he represented. His jacket wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a testament to his service, his sacrifices, and his pride. "Hey," Julian called out, leaning back in his chair. "I'm just joking. Man, no need to get all stiff on me. Lighten up." Derek's fork clattered onto his plate as he set it down with deliberate calm. His muscles were taut, his mind racing with 1,000 comebacks. He knew he couldn't let this slide, but he also knew he had to handle it carefully. The dining room had gone eerily quiet now. All eyes were on Derek and Julian, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek's voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but cold. "You think you're funny?" Derek asked, his tone low but carrying an edge that made Julian's smirk falter. "Just a bit of banter," Julian replied with a shrug, though the confidence in his voice had waned. Derek stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He wasn't a large man, but the intensity in his posture made him seem larger than life. He took a step closer to Julian's table, his gaze unwavering. "You see this jacket?" Derek said, his voice clear and calm, but laced with an undercurrent of emotion. "It's not just some army surplus. It's a reminder of the people I fought beside, the friends I lost, and the sacrifices we made so people like you could sit in places like this and look down on us." Julian's friends looked uncomfortable now, their laughter silenced. Even Julian seemed to shrink in his seat, the weight of Derek's words cutting through his bravado. The room was silent, every diner hanging on Derek's next words. But instead of continuing, Derek took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly. He wasn't here to humiliate Julian. He just wanted to be heard. Without another word, Derek turned and walked back to his table, his head held high. The silence in the restaurant was deafening, but Derek didn't care. He had said his piece, and that was enough. As he sat down, Derek noticed the subtle nods of approval from a few diners, the way the staff moved a little more attentively around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not for his past or his struggles, but for the strength of his character. Derek didn't need Julian's respect or approval. He had his own dignity, and that was enough. The weight of silence. Derek sat back in his chair, his body rigid as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He had faced far greater challenges in his life. Combat zones where every step felt like it might be his last, sleepless nights haunted by memories of friends he couldn't save. But something about this moment gnawed at him in a way he didn't expect. Across the room, Julian Beck sat in stunned silence. The smug grin that had dominated his face only moments earlier had disappeared. His companions exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier amusement replaced by awkward fidgeting. The tension in the restaurant hummed like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Derek's eyes fell to his plate. The food, once appetizing, now felt like a chore. He wanted to push the whole encounter out of his mind, but the weight of what had just happened pressed against his chest. He couldn't help but replay the moment over and over, wondering if he had handled it the right way. His mother's voice echoed in his mind again. "Don't stoop to their level, Derek. Dignity speaks louder than anger." She'd raised him to believe that strength didn't always mean fighting back. Sometimes it meant holding your ground with quiet resilience. But was that enough? He glanced around the room, noticing how the other diners avoided his gaze. They were whispering now, their hushed voices barely audible over the clinking of silverware. Derek had been in enough social situations to know what they were thinking. Who is he? Why did he react that way? Was it really necessary to confront the man? Derek clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles white. He wasn't just angry at Julian. He was angry at the room, at the people who had witnessed the entire exchange and said nothing. Their silence was as loud as Julian's insults, a complicit reminder of how often people chose comfort over courage. The waiter returned, his face pale but professional. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. Not really. Across the room, Julian shifted in his chair, his confidence clearly rattled. His friends tried to resume their conversation, but the energy at their table had shifted. Julian leaned forward, whispering something to the man seated next to him, but his usual swagger was gone. Derek felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't wanted to make a scene. That wasn't who he was. He had spent most of his life avoiding unnecessary attention, blending into the background, and quietly doing his job. But there was something about Julian's words, so dismissive, so dehumanizing, that had triggered something deep inside him. It wasn't just about him, Derek realized. It was about every soldier who had been dismissed, every person who had been judged for how they looked, every moment he had been made to feel like he didn't belong. He looked down at his jacket, the faded patches a testament to years of service and sacrifice. It wasn't flashy or expensive, but it carried a weight that no tailored suit could match. Derek took a deep breath and closed his eyes, trying to center himself. He thought about his time in the military, the camaraderie, the challenges, the moments that had shaped him into the man he was today. He remembered the faces of his comrades, the way they had laughed and joked even in the darkest of times. Those memories reminded him of why he had joined the army in the first place. He had wanted to prove something, not just to himself, but to the world. He had wanted to show that he was more than the labels people had placed on him, that he could rise above the limitations society had tried to impose. Derek's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching his table. He looked up to see a woman in her early 40s standing there, her expression kind but hesitant. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Derek raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "For what?" "For standing up to him," she replied, glancing briefly at Julian's table. "I've seen him behave like that before, and no one ever says anything. But you didn't let him get away with it." Derek blinked, caught off guard by her words. "I wasn't trying to make a point," he said. "I just couldn't let it slide." The woman smiled, her expression warm. "Well, whether you meant to or not, you did make a point, and it mattered." She hesitated for a moment, then extended her hand. "My name's Claire, by the way." Derek shook her hand, feeling a small spark of gratitude for her support. "Derek Saunders." Claire nodded, her gaze lingering on his jacket. "You served?" "Yeah," Derek replied, his voice quieter now. "A few years overseas. Feels like a lifetime ago." Claire's expression softened. "Well, thank you for your service. And thank you for reminding people like him that respect isn't something you can buy." With that, she walked away, leaving Derek alone with his thoughts once again. He glanced over at Julian's table, where the man was now conspicuously silent. Derek could see the discomfort etched across his face, the way he avoided making eye contact with anyone. For the first time that afternoon, Derek felt a sense of calm wash over him. He hadn't planned to confront Julian, but maybe Claire was right. Maybe it had been necessary. As Derek picked up his fork and took another bite of his meal, he realized something important. Standing up for himself wasn't just about proving a point to Julian or anyone else. It was about proving something to himself, that he deserved to be seen, heard, and respected, no matter where he was or what he wore. The whispers in the room began to fade, the clinking of silverware and soft murmur of conversation returning to normal. Derek focused on his plate, savoring each bite of food as if it were a small victory. For the first time in a long time, Derek didn't feel out of place. He belonged here just as much as anyone else. And no one, not Julian Beck or anyone like him, could take that away from him. The unspoken reckoning. Derek finished his meal with quiet determination, each bite feeling heavier than the last. The confrontation with Julian had drained him, but it had also sparked something inside. A simmering mix of pride and discomfort. He had stood his ground, yet a small voice in his head whispered, did it really make a difference? He glanced at Julian's table. The man's usual bravado had waned, and though he continued speaking with his companions, his movements were more subdued. Derek could see it, The stiffness in Julian's shoulders, the way his eyes darted around the room, avoiding contact. The confrontation had rattled him. Derek wasn't sure whether that was enough. The waiter approached again, clearing away Derek's plate. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Is there anything else I can get you, sir? Perhaps dessert or coffee?" "No, thank you," Derek replied, his voice calm but firm. "Just the check." The waiter nodded, retreating quickly. Derek leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The dining room had begun to settle back into its usual rhythm, but every now and then he caught snippets of hushed conversations and sideways glances. The other diners weren't as discreet as they thought. He could feel the weight of their judgment, not all negative, but still invasive. Some seemed to approve of his actions, offering faint smiles or nods when he caught their gaze. Others, however, appeared disapproving, their faces tight with discomfort. To them, Derek was a disruption, a reminder of things they'd rather not think about: privilege, prejudice, and the quiet injustices woven into daily life. Derek tried to ignore it all, but his mind kept circling back to the encounter. He thought of his mother again, the lessons she had drilled into him about patience and restraint. But he also thought of his father, a man of few words but unshakable principles. "There's a time to walk away, son," his father had once said, "and there's a time to stand firm. The hard part is knowing which is which." This time, Derek had chosen to stand firm. Yet he wondered if the impact of his words had truly reached Julian, or if it had just been another fleeting moment in a world full of them. Just as Derek was about to rise from his seat, a voice cut through the low hum of the restaurant. "Excuse me." Derek turned to see Julian Beck standing a few feet away from his table. The man's earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by an expression that was harder to read, somewhere between hesitation and determination. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of nearby diners once again. Julian cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I wanted to talk to you." Derek raised an eyebrow, his face impassive. He motioned for Julian to continue. Though he remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert. Julian hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for the right words, or perhaps an escape route. Finally, he met Derek's gaze. "Look, I know what I said earlier was out of line," Julian began, his voice quieter than before. "And I'm not here to make excuses, but I guess I just didn't think." Derek tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You didn't think," he repeated, his tone even. Julian winced. "I didn't think about how my words might affect you, or anyone else. I wasn't trying to be cruel, I swear. I was just joking." "Joking," Derek echoed, his voice sharp enough to make Julian flinch. Julian nodded quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Yeah, but I see now that it wasn't funny. It was wrong, and I'm sorry. Really." Derek studied Julian carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. He had encountered men like Julian before, people who wielded their privilege like a weapon, only to offer hollow apologies when confronted. But Julian's demeanor was different now. His earlier bravado had crumbled, leaving behind a man who seemed genuinely uncertain, even vulnerable. "You're sorry," Derek said finally, his tone neutral. "Do you even know what you're sorry for?" Julian blinked, caught off guard by the question. I guess I'm sorry for assuming things about you, for judging you based on your appearance, or your jacket, or whatever." Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. "You didn't just judge me, Julian. You dismissed me. You looked at me and decided that I didn't belong here, that I wasn't worth the same respect as you or anyone else in this room." Julian opened his mouth to respond, but Derek held up a hand, silencing him. "And it's not just about me," Derek continued. "It's about everyone who's ever been dismissed, overlooked or belittled because they don't fit someone else's idea of what success looks like. You don't get to excuse that with a joke. Julian's face reddened, and he nodded slowly. You're right, he said quietly. You're absolutely right. I don't have an excuse. I don't know. I've never really thought about things like that before. Maybe it's time you start, Derek said bluntly. For a moment, there was silence between them. Julian looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping slightly. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, almost apologetic. Look, I know an apology doesn't fix everything, Julian admitted. But I mean it when I say I'm sorry. And I'd like to make it right, if I can. Derek raised an eyebrow, skeptical. How exactly do you plan to do that? Julian hesitated, then gestured toward his table. I don't know yet, but maybe it starts with listening, really listening. To people like you, who've been through things I can't even imagine. I can't change the past, but I can try to be better moving forward. Derek studied Julian for a long moment, weighing his words. He wasn't sure if Julian's apology would lead to genuine change, or if it was just an attempt to ease his own guilt. But there was something about the man's demeanor that made Derek pause. Actions speak louder than words, Derek said finally. If you really want to make it right, start by thinking before you speak, and remember that respect isn't something you give only to people who look or act like you. Julian nodded, his expression earnest. I will. Thank you, Derek, for calling me out, for making me see things differently. Derek didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure if Julian's gratitude was warranted, but he nodded once, signaling the end of the conversation. As Julian returned to his table, Derek leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't sure if he had made a lasting impact, but for the first time that day, he felt a small measure of peace. Sometimes, standing up for yourself wasn't about winning or losing. It was about planting a seed, a small but meaningful reminder that respect and dignity were not negotiable. Derek glanced out the window at the bustling city streets beyond, his mind quiet for the first time in what felt like hours. The world wasn't perfect, but moments like these reminded him that change, however small, was always possible. The ripple of courage. Derek remained seated, watching Julian retreat to his table with the same unsteady gait of someone who'd been caught off guard. He noticed the shift in Julian's posture, his once proud shoulders now slightly hunched, his face taut with discomfort. It wasn't defeat Derek saw, it was reflection, perhaps even shame. But Derek wasn't here to evaluate Julian's emotions. He had already said his piece, and as far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. Or at least, it should have been. The waiter returned with the bill, placing it delicately on the table as if afraid to disturb the fragile air that had settled over the room. Derek nodded, pulling out his wallet, but the waiter lingered. Sir, the young man said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, I just wanted to say. That was inspiring. What you said back there. Derek looked up, surprised. The waiter's face was earnest, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I've seen people like him. Mr. Beck, treat others like that before. The waiter continued. Most people don't say anything. They just let it happen. But you stood up to him. It means a lot to people like me. Derek's throat tightened. He hadn't considered how his actions might resonate with others in the room. He had been so focused on confronting Julian that he hadn't noticed the ripple effect it might have. Thanks, Derek said simply, offering a small smile. The waiter nodded, his expression softening. Let me take care of your bill. Sir, it's on the house. Derek's eyebrows shot up in surprise. That's not necessary, he began, but the waiter shook his head. It's the least I can do, he insisted. Please. Consider it a thank you from all of us who've had to bite our tongues. Derek hesitated but finally relented, nodding his gratitude. As the waiter walked away, Derek felt a mixture of humility and unease. He hadn't stood up to Julian for praise or reward. He had done it because he couldn't stomach the idea of letting such blatant disrespect go unchecked. But perhaps that was the real lesson. Courage wasn't just for yourself. It was for those who couldn't always find their voice. Across the room, Julian sat stiffly at his table, his drink untouched. His companions had returned to their conversations, but the energy at their table was noticeably subdued. Julian's gaze flicked toward Derek, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Derek wondered if Julian would approach him again, but the man stayed seated, his fingers drumming nervously on the tablecloth. Derek wasn't sure what to make of it. He had expected Julian to brush off the confrontation with more smugness, perhaps even doubling down on his arrogance. But instead, Julian seemed contemplative. Derek decided it didn't matter. He wasn't responsible for Julian's growth, or lack thereof. What mattered was that he had spoken his truth, and the rest was up to Julian. Just as Derek was preparing to leave, a woman approached his table. She was tall and composed, her sleek black dress emphasizing her graceful movements. Her dark eyes held a mix of curiosity and admiration as she extended her hand. "Derek Saunders, right?" she asked, her voice smooth and confident. Derek stood, shaking her hand. "Yes, that's me." "I'm Claire Donnelly," she said with a warm smile. "I was sitting a few tables over, and I couldn't help but overhear what happened. I just wanted to say, thank you." Derek tilted his head, confused. "For what?" "For standing up to Julian," Claire replied, her tone genuine. "I've worked with him before. He's a big name in some of the circles I navigate. And let's just say, I've seen his behavior go unchecked far too often. People usually let it slide because they're afraid of burning bridges. But you?" She paused, studying him. "You didn't hesitate. That takes guts." Derek shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I didn't do it for recognition. I just couldn't let him get away with it." Claire's smile deepened. "That's precisely why it matters." She pulled out a business card from her clutch and handed it to him. "I work with an organization that supports veterans transitioning back into civilian life. We focus on career development, mental health, and advocacy. Someone with your strength and conviction could make a real difference." Derek stared at the card, the name of the organization, Valor Forward, printed in bold letters. "You don't have to decide anything now," Claire added, sensing his hesitation. "But if you ever want to share your story or even just learn more about what we do, give me a call." Derek nodded slowly, slipping the card into his pocket. "Thank you. I'll think about it." As Derek left the restaurant, the cool Chicago air hit him like a balm, clearing the heaviness from his chest. He walked a few blocks in silence, his mind replaying the events of the afternoon. He thought about Julian's words, the weight they carried, and the way they had stirred something deep within him. He thought about Claire's offer, and the unexpected support he had received from strangers. But most of all, he thought about the power of moments, how a single decision, a single act of courage, could ripple outward, touching lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. Derek paused at a crosswalk, the city bustling around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. He didn't need to be defined by the judgments of others. His worth wasn't tied to the opinions of people like Julian Beck. It was tied to the values he lived by: the courage to speak up, the strength to stand tall, and the humility to inspire change without seeking credit. As the light turned green, Derek crossed the street, his steps purposeful. The world wasn't perfect, but today he had made it a little better. And for now, that was enough. Confronting the past, Derek's steps carried him further away from the restaurant, yet his mind remained tethered to the events inside. The brisk Chicago wind nipped at his face, but he barely noticed. His thoughts churned, shifting between Julian's unexpected apology, Claire's intriguing offer, and the lingering sense of unease that always followed moments like this. He turned onto a quieter street, his boots crunching softly against the sidewalk. As the noise of the city faded into the background, Derek's mind drifted to memories he had tried hard to bury. Confrontations like the one with Julian had a way of stirring things up, echoes of past battles, both on the field and within himself. Derek had grown up in a small, tight-knit town in Georgia. Life had been simple, but not easy. He was the youngest of 4 siblings, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. Money was always tight, but there was love in their home, even when the world outside felt unforgiving. As a child, Derek had learned early how to navigate the subtle and overt prejudices that came with being one of the few black families in town. He had endured the whispered slurs, the sideways glances, and the constant feeling of being out of place. "Keep your head up, baby," his mother would say, her voice steady but soft. "Don't let them dim your light. You're worth more than they'll ever know." Her words had kept him going, even when the weight of the world felt unbearable. But it wasn't until Derek joined the army that he began to understand what true resilience meant. The military had been his escape, his chance to prove himself on his own terms. He had enlisted at 18, fresh out of high school, determined to carve out a future beyond the narrow confines of his hometown. But the army wasn't just an escape, it was a crucible. Derek's first deployment was to a conflict zone in the Middle East, a place where danger lurked around every corner. He had been part of a tight-knit unit, a group of men and women who became his family in ways he hadn't anticipated. They were from all walks of life, bonded by their shared mission and the unspoken understanding that they might not all make it home. The horrors of war were seared into Derek's memory. He had seen things no one should ever have to see: friends falling in battle, innocent lives caught in the crossfire, the relentless toll of violence on the human spirit. But it wasn't just the battlefield that tested him. Even within the military, Derek had faced moments of prejudice and ignorance. There were those who questioned his abilities because of his race, who underestimated him until he proved them wrong time and time again. He had learned to rise above it, to let his actions speak louder than words. But the scars it left behind were real, and moments like the one with Julian brought those scars to the surface. Derek's thoughts returned to the present as he reached a small park. He sat on a bench, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. The cool air filled his lungs, grounding him as he tried to sort through his emotions. Julian's apology had been unexpected, but Derek couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Words were easy. Change was hard. And Derek had seen too many empty apologies to believe that one moment of clarity could undo a lifetime of ignorance. But then he thought about Claire, her sincerity, her belief that his actions had made a difference. She had seen something in him, something he wasn't sure he saw in himself. Derek pulled out the business card she had given him, studying it under the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. The name Valor Forward stood out in bold letters, along with Claire's contact information. Career development, mental health, advocacy, Derek murmured, reading the tagline beneath the organization's name. He felt a pang of doubt. What could he offer an organization like that? He wasn't a polished speaker or a leader. He was just a guy trying to make sense of his place in the world. But another voice in his mind, the voice of his first commanding officer, spoke up. Leadership isn't about being perfect, Saunders. It's about showing up, speaking out, and making others believe they can do the same. Derek's grip on the card tightened. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe there was something he could do. As he sat there, lost in thought, Derek became aware of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see a man in a tailored coat, his breath visible in the crisp air. It took Derek a moment to recognize him. It was Julian Beck. Derek straightened, his expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone neutral but firm. Julian hesitated, shoving his hands into his pockets. I wanted to talk," he said, his voice quieter than before. Derek raised an eyebrow. "Haven't we said everything that needed to be said?" Julian shook his head, taking a cautious step closer. "Maybe you have, but I haven't." Derek gestured for Julian to sit, though his skepticism was evident. Julian took the spot at the other end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city filled the silence. The hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the wind. "I've been thinking about what you said," Julian began, his voice low. "About respect and assumptions, and all of it. And you're right. I've spent my whole life looking at people through a narrow lens. I didn't even realize I was doing it most of the time. But that doesn't excuse it." Derek studied him carefully. Julian's usual confidence was absent, replaced by something raw and uncertain. "I've been successful in business," Julian continued, "but I don't think I've ever really looked beyond my own bubble. Today was the first time someone called me out in a way I couldn't ignore. And I want to do better. I just don't know where to start." Derek leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "Start by listening," he said. "Not just to me, but to people who don't look like you, who don't live like you. And don't just listen. Learn. Challenge your assumptions. Be willing to admit when you're wrong." Julian nodded slowly, absorbing Derek's words. "I want to," he said. "I really do. But I know it's going to take time." "Change always does," Derek replied. "The question is whether you're willing to put in the effort." Julian looked at him, his expression sincere. "I am. And thank you. For not just letting it slide, for making me see what I didn't want to see." Derek nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We all have blind spots, Julian. What matters is what you do once you see them." As Julian rose to leave, he extended a hand. Derek hesitated for a moment, then shook it firmly. "Take care, Julian," Derek said, his voice steady. "You too," Julian replied, before walking away into the night. Derek sat alone on the bench for a while longer, his thoughts quieter now. He didn't know if Julian would follow through on his promise to change, but for the first time, Derek felt at peace with whatever the outcome might be. Sometimes, standing up for yourself wasn't just about the here and now. It was about planting a seed, even if you never got to see it grow. Derek glanced at the business card in his hand, his mind made up. Tomorrow, he would call Claire. It was time to take the next step, not just for himself, but for the countless others who needed someone to stand up, speak out, and lead the way. The road to redemption. The next morning, Derek awoke to the pale sunlight filtering through his apartment blinds. The events of the previous day still lingered in his mind, but the clarity of the morning brought a renewed sense of purpose. His fingers brushed against the business card Claire had given him, now sitting on his nightstand. He picked it up, turning it over thoughtfully. The name Valor Forward stood out boldly, and beneath it, Claire's handwritten note, "You belong here." For a moment, Derek sat in silence, the weight of those words settling over him. He had spent so much of his life fighting to belong, whether in his small hometown, the military, or the civilian world. The idea that someone like Claire could see something in him that he hadn't even acknowledged himself was both humbling and daunting. He set the card down and began his morning routine, each step grounding him. He wasn't one to rush into decisions without careful thought, but something about this opportunity felt different. It wasn't just a chance to share his story, it was a chance to help others find their voice. As the morning unfolded, Derek's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, surprised to see an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, a cautious hello escaping his lips. "Derek, this is Julian Beck." Derek blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected to hear from Julian again so soon, if at all. "How'd you get my number?" Derek asked, his tone measured. "I asked Claire," Julian admitted. "I hope that's okay. I wasn't sure if I should call, but I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday." Derek exhaled, his initial surprise giving way to curiosity. "What do you want, Julian?" "I want to do better," Julian said, his voice tinged with sincerity. "You were right. I've been blind to a lot of things, and I don't want to stay that way. I want to understand, not just for my sake, but for the people around me." Derek paused, considering his response. He had heard promises like this before, but something about Julian's tone felt genuine. "Understanding doesn't come overnight," Derek said finally. "It takes effort. You have to be willing to face uncomfortable truths, and you have to be okay with being wrong sometimes." "I know," Julian replied, "and I'm ready for that. I was wondering if you'd be willing to meet with me. Maybe help me figure out where to start." Derek hesitated. Part of him wanted to keep his distance, to let Julian figure things out on his own. But another part, the part that believed in the power of dialogue and connection, saw an opportunity. "Fine," Derek said, "but this isn't about me teaching you. It's about you doing the work." "Understood," Julian said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you to Derek. I mean it." Later that afternoon, Derek found himself sitting across from Julian at a small cafe near the river. The atmosphere was casual, but the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Julian had arrived early, dressed in a sweater and jeans that were far more understated than his usual tailored suits. "I appreciate you meeting me," Julian began, breaking the silence. Derek nodded, his expression neutral. "What do you want to know?" Julian hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Everything," he said finally. "I want to understand your experiences, what shaped you, what you've gone through. I feel like I've spent my whole life looking at the world through a narrow lens, and I need to widen it." Derek studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. "You need to understand that my story isn't universal," he said. "What I've been through isn't the same as what others have experienced. If you really want to learn, you need to listen to a lot of voices, not just mine." Julian nodded, his expression serious. "I get that, but I think hearing your story is a good place to start." Derek took a sip of his coffee, organizing his thoughts. For a moment, he considered brushing Julian off, keeping things surface level. But then he remembered Claire's words. "You never know who might be listening." So he began to speak. He told Julian about growing up in Georgia, about the quiet but persistent challenges of being one of the few black families in a predominantly white town. He spoke about his decision to join the Army, the camaraderie he had found there, and the unrelenting trauma that came with service. He talked about the friends he had lost, the scars he carried, both visible and invisible, and the challenges of returning to a world that often failed to understand what it meant to serve. Julian listened intently, his gaze never wavering. He asked questions, not in a prying or performative way, but with genuine curiosity. "I had no idea," Julian said quietly when Derek paused. "I mean, I've always respected the military, but I never thought about what it must be like to carry all of that, to come back and feel like no one really sees you." "That's the thing," Derek said, his voice steady. "Most people don't see us. They see the uniform, the medals, maybe even the scars, but they don't see the person behind all of that. They don't see the struggle, the sacrifices, the humanity." Julian nodded, his expression somber. "I want to change that. I don't know how yet, but I want to try." Their conversation stretched into the evening, the cafe growing quieter as the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time they parted ways, Derek felt a cautious sense of optimism. Julian wasn't perfect, far from it, but he seemed willing to put in the work. As Derek walked home, his phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "Claire, I heard you met with Julian. How did it go?" Derek smiled faintly, typing a quick response. "Derek, better than I expected. He's got a long way to go, but I think he's serious." A moment later, her reply came through. "Claire, that's good to hear. By the way, we're hosting a panel for veterans next week. Think you'd be interested in speaking?" Derek paused, staring at the message. The idea of standing in front of a crowd, sharing his story, was daunting. But as he thought about Julian, Claire, and the impact of a single moment of courage, he realized it might be worth it. "Derek, count me in." With that, he slipped his phone into his pocket and continued walking, the cool night air invigorating him. Change was slow, messy, and uncertain, but Derek was beginning to understand its power. Sometimes it started with a confrontation. Sometimes it started with a conversation. But most importantly, it started with showing up. A voice worth hearing. The auditorium hummed with a low murmur of conversation as people filtered in, their voices blending into a symphony of anticipation. Derek Saunders stood backstage, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his fingers brushing against the smooth fabric of the new blazer Claire had insisted he wear. He felt out of place. Again. "You look fine," Claire said, her voice steady and reassuring as she adjusted the microphone, clipped to his lapel. "Trust me, you're going to do great." Derek met her gaze, his own filled with doubt. "I'm not used to this kind of thing," he admitted, his voice low. Claire smiled, her hands pausing. "You're not supposed to be used to it. You're here because your story needs to be heard. And trust me, these people want to hear it." He nodded, not entirely convinced. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit. He had spent his life avoiding the spotlight, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But Claire's persistence, and his own growing conviction, had brought him here. The event, hosted by Valor Forward, was a panel discussion featuring veterans who had transitioned to civilian life, sharing their challenges, triumphs, and perspectives. Derek had initially balked at the idea of being on stage, but Claire had convinced him. "Your voice matters, Derek," she had said. "You've lived experiences that most people can't even begin to understand. Sharing them could change the way they see the world and themselves." Now, as the program began and the crowd settled, Derek stood just off stage, watching the moderator introduce the panelists. The other veterans, a mix of men and women from various backgrounds, sat in a row of chairs, their expressions calm and composed. Claire touched his arm, drawing his attention. "You're up next," she said. Derek took a deep breath, steadying himself. As his name was called, he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding him. Applause rippled through the audience, and Derek forced himself to focus on the faces in the crowd. He took his seat, his heart pounding. The moderator, a middle-aged man with a warm demeanor, began with introductions, giving each panelist a chance to share their background. When it was Derek's turn, he hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. "My name is Derek Saunders," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "I served in the Army for 6 years, including 2 deployments overseas. I grew up in a small town in Georgia, and I guess you could say I joined the military to find a sense of purpose." He glanced at the audience, their attentive gazes encouraging him to continue. "My transition back to civilian life wasn't easy," he admitted. "I struggled with finding my place, with feeling like I belonged. And there were moments when it felt like the world didn't really see me, not for who I was, but for the assumptions they made about me." The room was silent, the audience hanging on his every word. "Recently," Derek continued, "I had an experience that reminded me of how important it is to speak up, not just for myself, but for others. I was in a situation where someone made assumptions about me because of how I looked, because of the jacket I wore, and for the first time in a long time, I decided I couldn't let it slide." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What I realized in that moment was that standing up for yourself isn't just about proving a point. It's about showing people that respect isn't optional, it's fundamental. And it's about giving others the courage to do the same." The moderator nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Derek, you've touched on something so important, the power of resilience and advocacy. How do you think we, as a society, can better support veterans and others who feel unseen or undervalued?" Derek considered the question, his gaze steady. "It starts with listening," he said. "Real listening, not just hearing words, but understanding the experiences behind them. It's about creating spaces where people feel safe to share their stories without fear of judgment." He leaned forward slightly, his tone earnest. "And it's about challenging ourselves to confront our own biases. Everyone has them, whether we realize it or not. The real work is being willing to acknowledge them and change the way we see the world and each other. The audience erupted into applause, their response genuine and heartfelt. Derek sat back, his chest tight with emotion. He hadn't expected to feel this way. Heard, valued, and for the first time in a long time, at peace. After the panel ended, attendees mingled in the lobby, discussing the insights they had gained. Derek stood near a table of refreshments, feeling a mix of relief and pride. He had done it. A young man approached him, his expression shy but determined. "Mr. Saunders," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story really resonated with me. I've been struggling with my own transition out of the military, and hearing you speak, it gave me hope." Derek's throat tightened. "I appreciate that," he said, shaking the man's hand. "You're not alone in this, and if you ever need support, organizations like this one are here to help." The man nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. "Thanks, it means a lot." As the man walked away, Derek felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Claire, her expression glowing with pride. "You were incredible," she said. "I knew you had it in you." Derek chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not sure about incredible, but I'm glad I did it." Claire smiled knowingly. "This is just the beginning, Derek. Your voice matters. And now, more people know that." That night, as Derek walked home under the glow of streetlights, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. The weight of his past still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a foundation, one he could build on to create something meaningful. For the first time, Derek understood that his experiences, his struggles and his triumphs weren't just his own. They were part of a larger story, a story worth telling. And he was ready to tell it.